so let's continue with this America Comes of Age conversation. Don't forget to be on the lookout for key terms and also check yourself to make sure that you can do the things that are on this list. Can you examine, evaluate, analyze, explain, compare, contrast, describe, those kinds of things. So we are going to go back and forth with our conversation about presidents here. We ended the last video or slideshow with talking about some minority movements, minority rights, and I wanted to pick that up a little bit with the Niagara movement, which is the creation of W.E.B. Du Bois, where he said that the denial of voting rights is a second slavery. And so securing voting rights is key to ending this so-called second slavery. And I want us to think about racial discrimination as a limit of progressivism, where progressives are out there sort of preaching making life better. They really are only focused on making life better for certain groups of people. And so this is a pretty significant failure to address racial discrimination, purposeful, not purposeful, however you want to sort of look at the events of this time period. You, in 1905, have the establishment of the Niagara movement. In 1908, you have riots in Springfield, Illinois. It eventually is going to lead to the founding of the NAACP. In 1913, you have the founding of the ADL, or the Anti-Defamation League, which is formed to combat anti-Semitism or discrimination against those of the Jewish faith. So all of this is going to be an important thing to know and to understand, that yes, progressivism did a lot of things for a lot of people, but not for everyone. And although Wilson did work to extend the power of the presidency and regulate new parts of American life, racial discrimination, securing voting rights, those kinds of things are not an area where the progressive movement focused. I've got a short little video clip here for Du Bois.
William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, later known as W.E.B. Du Bois, was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, on February 23, 1868. As a young man, Du Bois received a B.A. from Fisk University before becoming the first African American to earn a Ph.D. from Harvard in 1895.
What is impressive about W.E.B. Du Bois, when he went to Harvard, they wouldn't accept his 4-year Fisk degree. Du Bois also faced the problem of not being allowed to stay on the Harvard campus after 6 p.m. So if you put it in context historically, it was a great feat.
While teaching at Atlanta University, Du Bois produced a number of academic works, including The Philadelphia Negro in 1899, the first case study of a black community in the United States.
Du Bois went into these blighted areas. He found a population that had terrible health issues, a lot of social ills such as poverty, high infant mortality, prostitution. He didn't entirely excuse the African American population, but in his analysis, he was very forceful about pointing out racism as a reason for a lot of these ills.
Both Du Bois and Booker T. Washington emerged as advocates of their race. However, as an alternative voice to Washington's book Up From Slavery, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903.
It was an absolutely unique book. It contains poetry, autobiographical sketches, historical articles, memoir, a wide-ranging representation of the diversity of Black experience.
In 1905, Du Bois founded the Niagara Movement, opposing Booker T. Washington's racial accommodation theory. The organization became the forerunner of the NAACP, and years later, Du Bois was appointed editor of the NAACP magazine, The Crisis.
Du Bois wanted The Crisis to have two main components: protest on the one hand and uplift on the other. At the same time that he was protesting lynching and race riots, he was building a consciousness.
While continuing his work for civil rights, Du Bois published his first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, in 1911. 4 years later, he published The Negro, the first general history of Black Africans.
He was one of the early scholars who felt like you could not understand the status and condition of blacks in the United States unless you came to terms with the status and condition of Africa.
In 1920, Du Bois published the first of his 3 autobiographies, entitled Darkwater: Voices from Within the Veil. Then in 1935, Du Bois published his magnum opus, Black Reconstruction in America.
With his 3 autobiographies, and in a sense you could say his body of work, Du Bois gave us a document of what it was like to be black in the American century.
While becoming more influenced by communism, Du Bois made a losing bid for the New York State Senate at the age of 82. By 1961, Du Bois joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana, where he died on August 27, 1963.
W.E.B. Du Bois can be deemed arguably the most profound African-American intellectual of his generation. His ideas are still highly relevant for the present generation of scholars.
Okay. So moving on a little bit to talk about more about presidents, and I know like I said, we've been going back and forth between like Wilson and Roosevelt and Taft even. So we're going to talk a little bit more about Roosevelt here. In the late 1800s, the U.S. had several weak and ineffective presidents. The arrival of Teddy Roosevelt, a charismatic figure who embraced progressive ideals, ushered in a new era. Roosevelt pushed for many progressive reforms and expanded the power of the presidency. He changed the way Americans viewed the roles of the president and the government. Okay, so Roosevelt leaves the presidency after 2 terms in office. He says he wants to enjoy a private life, but he is still a member of the Republican Party and a very important member of the Republican Party. And he is going to use his sort of star power to help get his friend, Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, elected to the presidency in 1908. Roosevelt thought that Taft would continue his programs, but not necessarily, that did not necessarily come to fruition. So we're going to be talking about Roosevelt first, and then we will move on to Taft. This is a political cartoon. You see Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a well-known big game hunter, and there he is with his foot on the bad trusts, and he's put a collar around, sort of corralled the good trusts. So trusts, remember, are monopolies. These are big businesses, and many believe that they had gotten too big, right? Okay, so his political philosophy is going to be the square deal, but that's only at home. So as it says, he's a progressive at home domestically, but internationally, he's a social Darwinist. He believes that might makes right and that America's power should be sort of more on display. And that will become more and more important in the next topic that we discuss. But at home, his political philosophy is known as the square deal. He said, Americans aren't getting a square deal, and I can help you get a square deal. He believed that the job of government was to balance competing interests for the sake of the public good. So the public good, not the good of business, should be sort of at the forefront. He believed that some monopolies are not good, but some are. So you bust the bad trusts. He was known as a trust buster. You get rid of the bad trusts, but you regulate the good trusts. An example of that will be the Sherman Antitrust Act and other trust busting legislation that will pass. And he, again, will earn this reputation as a trust buster. That's on the bottom left, a campaign pin, a campaign button called, and you can see where it says the square deal, and how he believed in something called the 3 C's. He wanted to control corporations, he wanted to advocate for consumer protections, and he wanted to promote the conservation of natural resources. A little bit more about the big business feature here. Progressives agree that efficiencies and business regulation are important, but they disagree about what that looks like when it comes to monopolies. Should the government break up big business and restore competition? This is known as trust busting. For example, the Sherman Antitrust Act would allow the government to go in and say, you're too big, we need to split you up. Or is big business the most efficient way to organize the economy? Should we regulate big business to help prevent abuses like they do in the Interstate Commerce Commission, as we've talked about, of 1887? Some progressives even go so far as to push for socialist ideals, like Eugene Debs, a labor leader who promoted socialist ideas. And there he is there in the bottom right. The coal strike of 1902 is an important moment in business regulation. It sees the United Mine Workers go on strike. Essentially, it's a very big problem because if mine workers go on strike, then you know that there will be a toll on the wider population. So Roosevelt will go in and be a mediator and say, like, if you guys can't come to the table, then I'm going to sort of basically make you come to the table. Can the government do that? What sort of government would it be that would be able to do that? So the federal government as an arbiter in strikes is sort of promoted during this time period. In terms of regulating big businesses, they believed most trusts could and should be, Roosevelt did, believe that most trusts could and should be regulated and not busted. Congress will create the Department of Commerce and Labor at Roosevelt's urging in 1902. He will continue to broker these gentlemen's agreements between unions and businesses. In 1906, you see the Hepburn Act, which strengthens the Interstate Commerce Commission. It allows the government to regulate shipping rates charged by railroads and other carriers. He will also tackle that Upton Sinclair, that muckraker's book, with the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. So here's some legislation and then the effect. So the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the National Reclamation Act of 1902, the Elkins Act, the Hepburn Act, the Meat Inspection Act, and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Go back up to the National Reclamation Act, that's sort of like the outlier here where they're all sort of involved in trade and commerce. National Reclamation Act says it provides for federal irrigation projects by using money from the sale of public lands. Roosevelt was an environmentalist and a conservationist. The National Reclamation Act are sort of marrying this idea of environmentalism with this desire to promote the American economy. So how can we reclaim these lands that have been deemed unusable and better use the land that America has? I think that's really in line with conservationist values. Here's Roosevelt on the left with John Muir, who's on the right. Roosevelt's going to create a whole lot of national parks. He will have a close friendship with John Muir, who is a noted preservationist. If you've ever been out to California, you'll know there are a lot of state parks with Muir's name, if you've ever heard of Muir Woods in California. So here they are in Yosemite, but they are not exactly alike. Roosevelt is considered a conservationist. Remember, I said he's a big game hunter. He believed in using the land and using the resources of the land, but doing so thoughtfully and wisely. Muir was more of a preservationist. He would not have been an advocate for big game hunting. And if you want to conserve, it means you're careful with your resources. If you want to preserve, it means that you don't want to use those resources. You want to keep them just as they are. So know that Roosevelt is a conservationist and that there are differences between conservationists and preservationists. Here are some examples of national land conservation. As it says, based on the information in the map, when were the majority of national parks established and what region of the country holds the largest parks? You can pause it here and look more closely if you're interested. So again, Roosevelt urged Americans to conserve natural resources. He advocates for the need to manage and conserve public land. You have the Reclamation Act that I mentioned in 1905. You have the hiring of professional land managers to regulate how federal land will be used, as opposed to just allowing lumber companies to maybe practice conservation. That's led by a man named Gifford Pinchot. I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I don't think I am. But anyway, he will be coming back to us when we talk about Taft. So in 1908, let me see if this gets bigger. Yes, it does. In 1908, we see the election of William Howard Taft. at the expense of Bryan. Remember William Jennings Bryan that we've talked about with populism. He continues to run for president unsuccessfully. Taft is a hand-picked successor of Roosevelt. Not only was he his Secretary of War, he was also a very close friend of Roosevelt's. I think Taft is my favorite president. That might be an unpopular opinion, but I like him. I think that the relationship between Taft and Roosevelt is really interesting because Roosevelt sort of assumed that Taft would keep up with his policies exactly, and Taft had some ideas of his own. It leads to a huge personal falling out between the two men. Roosevelt will end up running against Taft in the next election. Taft will actually end up becoming a Supreme Court justice and say that the Supreme Court was the honor of his life. Just some little interesting asides. But in 1908, with the backing of Roosevelt, Taft will win the presidency. Taft dislikes high tariffs, which is a very typical progressive attitude because he believed that it limited competition, that it hurt consumers, and that it protects trusts. However, it's controversial to lower tariffs. So Taft is going to attempt tariff reform, and it will split the Republican Party. And this will also be sort of the split of Roosevelt and Taft, or part of it. Progressives wanted to reduce tariffs. That was the progressive wing of the Republican Party. But conservatives wanted to keep tariffs high. You're going to end up with a compromise tariff called the Payne-Aldrich tariff, which does very little to lower tariffs, and progressives feel very abandoned by this. They feel Taft is no longer a true progressive, and you see here Taft is sort of attaching some sticks of dynamite here to a chained elephant, which is representing the GOP. It says getting ready for the 4th. Some fireworks there in terms of it says fake tariff reform that he has in his hand. In 1909, Taft is going to replace James Garfield, who is the Secretary of the Interior under Roosevelt, with his own man, William Ballinger. James Garfield was thought to be a conservationist. Ballinger was a conservative corporate lawyer. Ballinger will attempt to open public land to private development. And if you remember, Gifford, I really need to look up the pronunciation of his last name, accuses him to try to make a personal profit, and he will eventually be fired. It is just another reason why a lot of progressives are angry with Taft, and not just progressives in general, but specifically a very important progressive named Roosevelt. So here are some differences and similarities. Taft often offended progressives, sought to rein in presidential power. He thought that the executive branch had expanded too much, was considered a conservative Republican at the time, promoted foreign policy through trade and investment. Taft called his foreign policy dollar diplomacy. Roosevelt called his foreign policy big stick diplomacy, and in the next topic we'll talk more about that. Big stick diplomacy was like, I'm going to build up our military so that you know that if you step out of line, then you'll get the stick, right, that will attack you. Taft said, I'm going to economically build up others so that they know that if they get out of line, we will stop economically supporting them. The difference between big stick and dollar diplomacy. Roosevelt was the head of the Progressive Party, sought to increase presidential power, was a progressive Republican, and again promoted big stick diplomacy. They were both trustbusters. In fact, although Roosevelt has a trust-busting nickname, Taft actually busted more trusts than Roosevelt did. They were both Republicans, and they both promoted conservation. So, because of Roosevelt's disappointment in Taft, he is going to challenge him as a third-party candidate in the election of 1912. And almost always that's going to lead to the other party getting elected. So here comes Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is a Democrat. We know he's the president that will lead us into World War I, which we'll get to in the next topic. But Wilson, or 2 topics from now, I think, Wilson is a progressive, because remember, you can be a Republican progressive or a Democratic progressive. Stay tuned for more.